Hey buddies, Potato McWhiskey here, and today we're going to be talking about the current state of Civilization 6. I've done a couple of these videos before, which you can find linked below. And to start off with, we'll quickly talk about what they've improved on since I did my last video. First off, tons of exploits and bugs have been fixed with the game, much to the sadness of my friend the Spiffing Brit, whose entire diet consists of game exploits and memes to the point where he himself has actually become a giant meme. Too many exploits have been fixed to really list them all, but they did a great job cleaning up a lot of the issues with the game, especially when they listened to the feedback from the community. The first thing that's changed since I talked about them in my previous videos is amenities. Amenities are now a lot more important. Some of the significant changes include giving larger benefits and penalties for amenities. I think there's new great people that interact with amenities, and there's changes to civilizations like Scotland. These small reworks and tweaks have come together to make amenities more interesting to play around, especially for me. I'm a huge fan of the updates that the entertainment complex got, which now has an adjacency bonus for theatre squares, which I think is the most interesting change to a district in a long time. Another change is that buildings themselves are just a little bit more interesting. I went over some of the older, more boring buildings in a previous video. All of those boring buildings were given new interactions, such as the bank, the university, the stock exchange, and the seaport. However, I'm going to kind of couch that optimistic compliment with a criticism because all of those new interactions are tied to game modes. That means if you want those more interesting buildings, you also have to accept a whole bunch of other changes to the game as well, and you might not enjoy those other changes that have to be bundled together with them. The developers also went above and beyond, adding really cool civs to the game, reworking and updating older civs as well, and just generally buffing weak stuff alongside nerfing strong stuff. While there are a lot of balance problems with the new game modes, 95% of people play this game single player, so I don't have a problem with balance issues for what is primarily a single player experience. Any active multiplayer community will almost certainly use some kind of balance mod to bring extreme outliers into the fold, and anyone playing casual multiplayer with their friends will either use house rules and social pressure to adjust the rules of the game, so I don't think that this is a really big issue. I feel like the game is in an incredible place, and if we didn't receive any more updates, I'd be okay with that. But there is a massive elephant in the room that I think needs to be addressed, and that's the modding scene of the game. Here's the thing. I'm not an expert at modding or modding issues, but even though I think we will see another update for Civ 6, I thought if there was a chance that we wouldn't see an update, I wanted to bring attention to the modding scene because arguably mods are going to be the thing that keeps the game fresh and interesting for a large section of the player base, at least until the next Civ game is released. And possibly even beyond that into the future. Civ 5 is still going strong, in a large part due to the modding scene. Because modding is so important, I decided to reach out to some of the most prominent modders for Civ 6 to get some of their opinions. The three modders that I asked to comment were Sucretact, whose Oceans mod I've done a spotlight on not too long ago, Luigi, or Leugi, who also made some really awesome mods, and Lime, whose mods suck and I hate him. I'm just kidding, of course, Lime is a cool dude, and there will be links in the description of the video to each player's Steam Workshop profile so you can check out their mods. The big common theme that came across in all three statements were the barriers to entry for modding, and the lack of central communications for modders, and the asset limit bug. The first one is pretty self-explanatory. Civ 6 is the most complex Civ game in the series, especially when it comes to modding, because it relies so much on 3D art assets. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it means that players and modders have a lot of power to shape how the game looks and feels. One of the best examples of that was the Civ 5 reskin that was released for Civ 6. But the problem goes a little bit deeper than the game simply being complex to make mods for. Leugi in particular spoke about the lack of documentation for doing basic and simple tasks that were relatively trivial in previous games. Adding music requires a modder to learn how to use game development industry software, for example. This sort of thing is why mod development for Civ 6 is much slower and less advanced compared to Civ 5, even as we enter into the 5th year of the game's release. A lot of people attribute this to the lack of the DLL access, but I really do think that it's not the biggest hurdle that you have to overcome, because the capability of you to make mods in Civ 6 is actually quite powerful even without that DLL. Now, I do think it's too late for Firaxis to fix how difficult it is to mod for the game, but I do think going forward into the next Civ game, we would like to see just a little bit more documentation in a centralized place. Now, Firaxis did put out a fairly brilliant document in their development tools that gives a huge amount of documentation, but at the same time it's fairly limited and it lacked continuous updates. I mean, some of the follow-up expansion documentation was provided on Twitter, which is kind of the documentation equivalent of shoving your letter into the bin and wondering why the recipient never got it. Now, that's not to say any effort isn't appreciated, but I think we'd all like to see the Dragon Girl anime total conversion of Civ 6 in our lifetimes, and putting documentation into a central repository would go a long way towards me living out my fantasies of conquering the world as a 3,000-year-old red dragon who's also somewhat tsundere. The second point is actually not the fault of Firaxis at all, and it's almost entirely down to the modding community being fractured and uncooperative at times. Not to call out people directly here, because for the most part modders are lovely people who will spend their time and energy to help each other and freely share their work with credit. However, I have personally witnessed some modders are just massive jerks who refuse to share their code, who refuse to even let people, have a look at it to learn or, share knowledge, going so far as to take their mods down from the Steam workshop because they stopped working on them and they don't want anyone to learn anything from them. Now, just to be clear, that was something I saw. None of the modders that gave me statements here said anything remotely like that. They were far more concerned with, things like the death of central modding hubs and the advent of Discord, which has led to the modding community being quite fractured across many small hubs and communities. There's very little crosstalk between Discord servers, and it's almost certain that mods and modding in general for Civ 6 has suffered because each community is its own little bubble with their own little nuanced and pieces of information that another community might lack. I would bet money that, trial and error work has been repeated over and over and over again fruitlessly in order to discover how some obscure piece of modding work needs to be done, purely just because of how fractured the community is. Now, the solution to this lies in the hands of modders themselves, creators like me and the wider community. I don't know what that solution is, or if there even is one. I do have a couple of ideas though. The first one being is people like me need to make more mod spotlight videos. Modders also need to make an effort to post their mods in a more publicly accessible place and the knowledge they gain in a more publicly accessible place. Most importantly, a Googleable place. You can't Google a Discord server. You can't look up information off of a Discord server because they're not trawled by Google bots. And so I think that's like a key part of it. Because most of modding is either trial and error work, where you bash your head against a wall for a week, or you Google search the solution to the problem that you're having that someone else has already found a solution for. The third big theme for Civ 6 modding was the asset bug. If you don't know, basically there is what seems to be some sort of engine limitation in Civ 6 where if you load too many modded assets or just assets in general, the game will actually just straight up crash and not work. Now, for the vast majority of modders, this isn't a problem because most mods are quite small and they only have a handful of assets. However, there are certain mods that this affects disproportionately, in particular Leuji. Leuji makes these incredible art mods that completely change how the game looks and feels, and they've had to stop short because they're running up against engine limitations. They simply cannot add more art assets to the game without the mod crashing on game start. This problem actually went on for months without even being fully understood due to the lack of communication from Firaxis and the fractured nature of the modding community. Now granted, you have to add a lot of assets to actually trigger this crash, but even so, I think this sort of bug shouldn't exist in the game. It's not the end of the world if the asset limit bug wasn't fixed, as it's simply a limitation for modders to work around, but it does disproportionately affect cool, flavorful mods that have no gameplay effect, and those are honestly some of the best mods. Normally these videos come with a whole host of criticisms for the game, and to be honest, I'm actually now having a hard time coming up with them. A lot of the things I want to talk about are kind of integral to the experience of playing Civ 6 when you're doing some of the more interesting strategies. Take beelining for example. Beelining is when you ignore a portion of the tech tree to head directly to a specific technology. I could totally understand thinking that the existence of beelining as a strategy makes the game worse for you, and I can also totally see how it makes the game have more strategic depth depending on the kind of player you are. With that in mind, I think my criticisms of the game have actually become more about missing themes in the game and fundamental design rather than how you play it or how the game is balanced. The game is roughly balanced in the sense that there's a whole bunch of broken strategies, but they're all roughly viable in single player, and so there's no one size fits all strategies outside of a few small scenarios. You can also just play the game however you want and lower the difficulty. That's one of the beauties of the game. You have a ton of agency over how you experience it. I feel though there are missing mechanics from the game. Immigration in particular is a big one that stands out for me. In Civ, your population is very static, but in the real world, people move around all the time. It would be cool if there was conditions that caused growth to be moved around your empire or even between different empires. For example, if a city is at its housing limit, but it's still an incredibly important and prosperous city, perhaps immigration can punch through the negative growth impacts of a housing or amenity limit. When a city is conquered, the population is immediately reduced, but maybe it would be more interesting if some of them reappeared in other cities or other empires as units or population. Schisms and reformation of religion is also missing from the game. It would be really fun if you could somehow take someone's religion as your own and then start a schism to change a belief of the religion, which might result in both players adopting the new belief or possibly the religion actually bifurcating into two completely separate religions. It's not a hugely impactful mechanic, but it would be a really interesting narrative tool for players to create their own story in game. The 4X and grand strategy genre has also moved on significantly since Civ 5, in particular when it comes to narrative storytelling, thanks mostly from Paradox Interactive making event systems an incredibly important part of how we experience these games. While Civ 6 still works without these systems, I'd be interested to see if they put those kind of systems in place for a sequel, considering they heavily pioneered event systems in Beyond Earth, and it was arguably one of the best parts of the game's design. My personal bet is we might see a return to that kind of system in a future installment of the Civ series. When it comes to fundamental design, one thing that still rubs me the wrong way is how dependent you are on the quality of the land you get. Now this is a double-edged sword to fix, because if you make start locations roughly equal, you kind of end up muting the highs and lows of gameplay. I think part of the problem is that in Civ 6, if you want a yield, you have to commit pretty hard to it. In Civ 4 or Civ 5, if I want to slightly buff my unit production in a city, I can just throw down a barracks, maybe crack out a forge and pop out a couple of units for defense, and then move back to what I was doing. In Civ 6, that's a much bigger commitment. You have to give up a district slot to get an encampment and spend a long time building infrastructure before you ever see a return from it. Now I do think that constraining a player's choices can make a game more interesting, and I think in Civ 6 they pulled off those constraining decisions being interesting pretty well. But I also think that this introduced an element of frustration, especially for new players who are used to other Civ games. One of the most frustrating constraints you can come up against as a player is not having enough hills to make mines. The two most basic tile improvements of the game are farms and mines. These tile improvements were not created equally. Mines are, in almost every circumstance, just better than farms. And having your access to mines be completely dependent on having hills in your empire is a major frustration. I'm really not sure how you fix that problem, because that problem is linked to a genre-wide problem for 4X games, which is that production is always just the best yield to get ever. Even humankind suffers from that problem. In Civ 6, a hill tile isn't just better, it's just better. Part of the problem is that hill tiles are more independent than farms and are simpler to improve. They don't need anything near them to be stronger like farms do, and their upgrades come earlier into the tech and civic tree. Cut a long story short, mines are just too strong, and while growth is strong too, production and growth were not made equally, and it shows. Growth and production being so strong for snowballing kind of leads into the next problem, which is that specialists are still weak. Now I get that the game moved away from specialist-based economies like in Civ 5, but I'm quite disappointed that they haven't seen significant changes outside of a small buff that came a while back. They still are bad and really need something to give them some oomph. I heard another YouTuber describe it as wasted potential, and I somewhat agree. Specialists have the potential to be an interesting game mechanic, but as it stands, they just don't live up to it. When it comes to the AI, it is one of the most complained about things in the game, and I understand why. It's because they underperform in almost every scenario. My feelings are that the AI exists to be an interesting challenge for the player in single player, and that's the direction I'd like to see the developers lean into. I'm completely fine with the AI cheating in some ways, but I would really like to see them act just a little bit smarter with a view of being interesting agents to interact with, rather than being speed bumps on my way to victory. I think Civ 6 does a good job in this regard, outside of the scenarios where I snowball to a ridiculous level, and so it might be surprising for a lot of people to hear, but I'm mostly happy with the AI. The only exception to that is just how unfun it is to not have any access to a lot of the early game's great people and wonders on deity, because until Renaissance era, the AI gets just such a huge head start that it's almost insurmountable. I'd nerf them a lot in the early game and then progressively give them more and more insane buffs as we head into the late game. And honestly, just give them some rubber band cheats as well so they can catch up with a player who snowballs too hard. Mario Kart does it, so why not Civ 6? Speaking of rubber banding mechanics, I'd like to see more rubber banding mechanics in the game. Rush's ability for extra culture and science for being behind should just be baseline for every Civ. And the person getting traded to should get a whole bunch of extra gold in exchange for this osmotic culture and science pressure. I'm pretty sure EPSMod implemented this a few months ago after I suggested it. And I also think that being able to buy and sell Eurekas from other players would bring back a limited form of tech trading into the game as well, which I think would be really, really cool. You could even nerf it to where if you buy a Eureka, maybe you only get half of like the amount you normally do. Tech trading in of itself is a broken mechanic, but trading Eurekas is significantly less broken and makes a bit more sense. Giving me the blueprints to a fighter plane Eureka doesn't instantly give me the institutional knowledge to create them, but it gets me started, you know? I also think that Eurekas should just be handed out once a certain percentage of players on the map have researched a tech or civic, so that people can catch up a little bit easier. We might see some of these things change in a potential sequel, but I personally wouldn't even be expecting an announcement of a sequel until like the end of 2022 at the very earliest. And personally, I'm still hopeful that we might see a final update for Civ 6 in 2022. I'd say my hopes for that go down to near zero by the end of March and to fully to zero by July. So to wrap up that completely incoherent mess of a ramble that took me 3 months to write to get my thoughts straight on, Civ 6 is in a great place, whether or not we get another update. I'd like to see one more update for the game to tie up loose ends and add a couple of extra civs. Generally, the game does have problems, but those problems also enable some of the best parts of the game. Civ 6 definitely played a lot more like a board game than other Civs games, which in of itself is not a bad thing, but it's understandable as to why that might drive some players away from it. The AI is passably good, but I'd like to see more from it. The AI is too strong early game and too weak late game. Civ 6 doesn't have enough rubber band mechanics. The modding scene is fractured and not well supported. Part of the solution for that will be creators like me bringing awareness to mods. Part of it will be modders coming together and talking to each other about mod creation. And part of it comes from the community rewarding and supporting modders for their hard work. I'm not expecting to see any updates for a Civ sequel until 2023 at the very earliest, and likely not until 2024 for anything concrete. The reality is, if the game gets no more updates, the future of the game is in our hands. We have the tools and the knowledge to add stuff to the game and keep the fire burning for a long time to come. That's it for this video. I love you all very much, and I'll see you guys next time.